The Massachusetts Contingency Plan, which are the regulations that govern the notification, assessment, and cleanup of oil and hazardous material in Massachusetts, has a section dedicated to the management of waste materials. Today, we'll be talking about two types of waste materials called containerized waste and uncontainerized waste, and exploring how they fit into these waste management requirements. Now, before we actually begin, I want to let you know that because I want to keep this under 20 minutes, we're going to be moving pretty quickly through the material. But since you are watching a video, you can pause at any point along the way, stare at the screen, take in what you need to, or hit rewind a little bit, go back and listen to it over again. You are in control of the pace of this video. Now let's begin. We'll start with the basic question of what are uncontainerized waste and containerized waste? For our purposes today, uncontainerized waste and containerized waste are waste products that are separate from water, soil, sediment, or debris, meaning they're not mixed in with these other environmental media. While it's not a regulatory term, you may think of containerized waste and uncontainerized waste as pure waste material. They're not mixed in with other stuff. The Massachusetts Contingency Plan, or MCP for short, does have specific definitions for containerized waste and uncontainerized waste. Right now, you can take a moment, pause the video, and read through the actual definitions from the regulations. Let's take a look at some simple examples to get it all straight in our head, though. First, and possibly most obviously, if you come across a barrel full of waste material, this is waste in a barrel, it's in a container, it's containerized waste. If there's a leak in that barrel and all that oozy, gooey, smelly, stinking waste material leaks out and it pools in a ditch, well, the material that's pulled in the ditch is uncontainerized waste. That waste hasn't really changed much. It just has escaped from the container. The ditch is not considered a container. And it has not really mixed in with the surrounding environment, the soil or the groundwater. Once that waste starts mixing with the soil, seeping down into the soil, you no longer can separate the waste from the soil. You now have contaminated soil, and it's no longer uncontainerized waste material. And finally, to follow the migration of this contamination a little bit further, once the contamination moves through the soil and hits the groundwater and starts mixing with the groundwater, you now have, ta-da, contaminated groundwater, another contaminated media, which of course is not uncontainerized waste. So while these are fairly simplified examples of containerized waste, uncontainerized waste, and contaminated media, they do serve to help us get the terminology straight and keep it straight in our minds what we're talking about when we're talking about uncontainerized and containerized waste. One last thing, if you go back to the definitions of containerized waste in 40.0006, you'll note that MassDEP has inserted new language in that definition, very specifically noting that contaminated media and contaminated debris, meaning contaminated soil, contaminated groundwater, contaminated debris, do not become containerized waste simply when you're placing that contaminated media in containers. At that point, you have contaminated soil or contaminated groundwater or contaminated surface water, which are all remediation wastes in containers, but that does not make them containerized waste material. So now that we have the terminology straight, let's take a look at this from a different angle. In an ideal world, all waste is appropriately managed, and we'll start with a factory. And our factory, as much as we try to minimize it, does produce waste, but that waste is appropriately collected, and we send that waste away for appropriate treatment, perhaps reuse or recycling, or, if we can't help it, for disposal. And that waste management process has been working well for our little factory until sometimes it goes wrong. And there is a wide range of possibilities for when things go wrong. Here we got lucky. The tractor trailer overturned, but nobody was hurt, and our waste material remained in their containers, in the truck, and fixing it was a matter of removing it, offloading the barrels, and putting them on another truck and taking them away for, again, their appropriate treatment or disposal. Throughout this, the containerized waste remained containerized waste. If we're unlucky, our tanks rupture and our waste spills out across the road. It is now uncontainerized waste, and depending upon where it ends up, we may have a big problem. Here at MassDEP, we do receive a lot of notifications for overturned tractor-trailer trucks or tankers that have spilled some of their contents. This is a very common scenario. However, there are other places that you might run across containerized waste and uncontainerized waste at 21E sites. Examples of containerized waste include abandoned underground storage tanks that still have some residual fuel in them, or buried drums that you run across during a site investigation. Uncontainerized wastes are a little bit less common, but think of gasoline from a tanker that is pooling in a ditch, or dumped asbestos insulation that's discovered along the side of a road. So even if you start with containerized waste, once that material escapes from its container and starts getting out into the environment, potentially mixing with soil or water or sediment or surface water and debris, you have a much more complicated situation. That waste is no longer separate. And when it's cleaned up, the resulting waste is generally considered remediation waste. Even when you put it back into the containers, it's been mixed with other environmental media, and it's no longer that, quote, pure waste material that we usually see in containerized waste. At this point, a flowchart seems in order, one that will help illustrate the regulatory requirements that are embedded in the MCP for the management of remediation waste and containerized waste. Now, up to this point, we haven't even mentioned hazardous waste. So let's talk a little bit about that. Hazardous waste is regulated both by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and Massachusetts DEP. In Massachusetts, the regulations are 310 CMR 40.0000. So if the remediation waste at your site is also hazardous waste, then additional rules will apply to the transportation and disposal or treatment of that material. The rules about hazardous waste are complex, and this is not a training about hazardous waste. So let's just say for our purposes, the world is divided between hazardous waste and non-hazardous waste, and you need to know what kind you have in order to manage it appropriately. So let's focus on non-hazardous remediation waste for a second. We can break this category up into 3 separate boxes. 1, non-hazardous contaminated media. Contaminated media would be contaminated soil, contaminated groundwater, contaminated surface water, contaminated sediment. That's contamination mixed with some environmental media. Next would be non-hazardous contaminated debris. Debris is some manufactured object or plant or animal matter that is intended for disposal or is otherwise not serving its original use. The term debris includes such things as demolition and construction waste, or that material that's used to absorb or contain releases of oil and hazardous material at 21E sites after a spill. If it's contaminated, you now have contaminated debris. And finally, non-hazardous uncontainerized waste is considered remediation waste as well. Similarly, over on the hazardous waste side, we see that we can have hazardous contaminated media, we can have hazardous contaminated debris, and we can have hazardous uncontainerized waste. The difference between hazardous uncontainerized waste and non-hazardous uncontainerized waste is specific to the nature of the waste itself. You have to know what it is and where it came from in order to determine whether it's hazardous waste or not. As I mentioned earlier, if you have contaminated soil or contaminated debris or contaminated groundwater and you put that material in a container, it does not become containerized waste. Even when you put it into a container, the contamination is still mixed with the soil, water, sediment, or debris that you found it in. It's not a separate waste. So this is simply remediation waste that happens to be in a container, not containerized waste. And the same is true over on the hazardous waste side. If you have contaminated soil that's cleaned up and put in a drum for disposal, it's still hazardous waste, but it's not containerized hazardous waste. There are options for managing contaminated media and contaminated debris on site, although if it's a hazardous waste, the rules are, again, a little bit more complicated. If you're going to move non-hazardous remediation waste off-site, either for treatment or disposal, then a bill of lading is used to track the transport of the material and document the eventual disposal or treatment location. The rules are similar if you're going to move hazardous remediation waste off-site, but because it is hazardous waste, a hazardous waste manifest must be used to track the transportation and document the treatment or disposal location for that material. So for contaminated media, such as contaminated soil and sediment, or for contaminated debris, the process for managing that waste is similar whether it's non-hazardous or hazardous. But you do have to know what you're dealing with in order to make sure you're using the right forms and managing it appropriately. Now we'll bring the containerized and uncontainerized waste into the mix. First, a reminder that uncontainerized and containerized waste are waste products that are separate from, not mixed in with, an environmental media such as soil, water, or sediment, or debris. Containerized waste is not remediation waste. So I've started a new box in the center, colored yellow, in order to separate the path for containerized waste from the way we manage remediation waste. Like remediation waste, containerized waste may be non-hazardous or it may be hazardous waste. What determines that is the nature of the waste itself. A waste may be considered hazardous if it's specifically listed in the regulations, or if it exhibits characteristic properties that make it a hazardous waste. If neither of those conditions are true, then your containerized waste is a non-hazardous containerized waste and can be managed as such. If you have a non-hazardous containerized waste, then it's not a hazardous waste, it's not even a remediation waste. It may be managed as a solid waste using a material shipping record, or MSR, to track the transport and eventual treatment or disposal of that material. But if your container does contain hazardous waste, then you have containerized hazardous waste, and it must be transported off-site with a hazardous waste manifest for tracking the transportation and eventual disposal or treatment of that material. While we're on this slide, there are two other points I'd like to make. First, look at the center of the screen at the yellow boxes, the non-hazardous containerized waste and the hazardous containerized waste. You'll note that there's no option for the waste to remain on site, either to be treated or disposed of. It must be removed from the site. The second thing that you should note is that if you're removing waste from the site, and it doesn't matter what kind of waste, the remediation waste, containerized waste, whether it's hazardous waste, it's always going to be tracked with some kind of form. You are documenting, for the benefit of MassDEP, US EPA, and the public at large, what is happening to this waste, and documenting that it's going to a facility that is licensed to take it, be it containerized waste, remediation waste, or hazardous waste. The forms will differ based upon what kind of waste it is, but there's always a form, there's always a paper trail. Now, what happens if you have non-hazardous, uncontainerized waste? If you scoop it up and put it back in a container, do you now have non-hazardous containerized waste? In theory, yes. But think back to that example of a overturned tanker truck that spilled gasoline into a nearby ditch. Can you really clean up that spilled gasoline without including the surrounding soil or water that was in the ditch to begin with? Or is it more like putting a genie back in the bottle? And again, this is true whether you're starting from non-hazardous uncontainerized waste or hazardous uncontainerized waste. What goes back into that bottle or the container is not pure waste material that you started out with. It's going to be a mix of waste with soil or water or sediment, and as such will most likely continue to be managed as remediation waste rather than containerized waste. But because it is a hypothetical possibility, I will leave these lines there, but shaded out gray to emphasize that it's not a likely pathway. The most likely pathway is that this non-hazardous uncontainerized waste remains uncontainerized, in which case you have the same options that you have for the other remediation waste. It can be managed on site per the remediation waste requirements of the MCP, or if it's transported off-site for treatment or recycling or disposal, then a bill of lading will be used. Over on the hazardous waste side, the most likely pathway for managing the uncontainerized hazardous waste is that it remains uncontainerized. This pathway is only slightly more complicated due to the way that Massachusetts regulates oil and waste oil under the hazardous waste regulations. Uncontainerized hazardous wastes that are simply oil and waste oil may be managed in a way similar to the contaminated media or contaminated debris containing hazardous waste. This is because oil and waste oil are hazardous waste under the Massachusetts regulations, but not the federal regulations. For uncontainerized hazardous waste excluding oil or waste oil, if you want to manage the hazardous waste within the boundaries of the disposal site, you either have to get a hazardous waste permit or petition MassDEP for a decision to manage it without a hazardous waste license. Either way, if it's ever transported off-site for treatment or disposal, it has to be done so with a hazardous waste manifest. This is probably a good time to point out that a remedial action that actually separates the oil and hazardous material from either contaminated media or contaminated debris and captures that oil and hazardous material may be creating containerized waste. One good example of this would be if you have a treatment system on a water supply and you're filtering that water and the activated carbon accumulates and captures the oil and hazardous material on that. You have now transferred that contaminated material from the water to the containerized activated carbon. That is now a containerized waste. A common question we get at this point is, what? We've created a containerized waste? Is it now a hazardous waste? If the contaminated water you were filtering did not contain hazardous waste, it was simply non-hazardous remediation waste, then the containerized waste that you generate is also going to be non-hazardous. Conversely, if you're starting out with hazardous waste in the water and you filter that and you accumulate material on the carbon that originated as hazardous waste, and the containerized waste that you now have will also be hazardous containerized waste. The act of treating the water and capturing the contamination on the activated carbon does not by itself create hazardous waste. Whether it's hazardous waste or not depends upon what you started out with, which side of this flowchart you originally were on. And while, yes, there may be some unique circumstances where treating the contamination concentrates it to a point that it becomes explosive or flammable, that would create a hazardous waste, but that kind of treatment is highly unlikely in the situations we usually encounter. So there you have it. Containerized waste is not a remediation waste. It comes in two flavors: non-hazardous containerized waste and hazardous containerized waste. Non-hazardous containerized waste can be shipped off-site using a material shipping record, or MSR. Hazardous containerized waste must be shipped off-site using a hazardous waste manifest. Remediation waste comes in many flavors. The two big categories are non-hazardous remediation waste and hazardous remediation waste. Within these, you have contaminated media, contaminated debris, and uncontainerized waste. These may be non-hazardous or hazardous. Non-hazardous remediation waste may be managed on-site under the MCP or transported off-site for treatment, recycling, or disposal using a bill of lading. On the other side of the flowchart, hazardous remediation waste may still be managed on-site, although the rules may be a little more complicated. And if transported off-site for disposal or treatment or recycling, you must use a hazardous waste manifest. In the end, when you're dealing with waste at a site governed by the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, probably the most important question that you'll be facing is whether the waste is a hazardous waste or not. That is the question, regardless of whether the waste is containerized waste, uncontainerized waste, contaminated debris, or contaminated media. The fundamental question is it hazardous waste or not? Because that will determine how that material is managed.